Hi teachers, the math coaches and I are glad you're here for the mini lesson PD, so let's get started. As we move through our presentation today, we are going to be talking about 3 different things to keep in mind as you are working through a mini lesson and planning for your mini lesson. Those 3 ideas are focused, intentional, and clear. So just kind of revisiting the explanation and what is expected for a mini lesson time. Hopefully you are able to connect the idea of a mini lesson to maybe another subject or a whole group mini lesson that you've already taught during the math workshop. But we really want to focus during this time of the block on making a big impact in a short amount of time. So gone are the days when students would sit and the teacher would speak or teach for a majority of the class. And instead, this is really going to be the time when students are involved in exploration or a variety of formats during a mini lesson. So remembering that the mini lesson should be daily. This should be a consistent time for both you as the teacher and for your students. The idea that it should be around 15 minutes each day, knowing that some skills may take a little bit less, some skills may take a little bit longer, but it should just stay around that 15-minute time for the most part. And the idea that it is standards-based. This is the time during your block when students are exposed to their grade level standard. If they're in 3rd grade, they should be learning about 3rd grade standards. So keeping in mind that our mini lesson should always be standards-based. So like I said at the beginning, our considerations for today when we're thinking about our mini lesson should be focused, it should be intentional, and it should be clear. These are going to be the 3 ideas at the center of our time today. So just knowing that you may plan with your grade level team, you may plan with other people, but there are many different directions a standard and a mini lesson can go. So we're going to explore ways that you can be sure that you're making a mini lesson your own, you're making it fit you as a teacher and your students, but always remaining focused, intentional, and clear. So our first big idea of being focused. As you're planning a mini lesson, we want you to keep 2 questions in mind. So as you look at the screen, the first question being, based on the standard you chose, how did you decide on a specific focus for the lesson? So how did you decide the specific skill that you're teaching within a standard? And the second question being, could you have done anything to make your mini lesson more focused? Could you have broken that standard down in order to teach a certain skill specifically? So in order to explore this topic, we're going to take a look at just an example standard right here. This is from 3rd grade 3 NS 6. So the standard reads, understand 2 fractions as equivalent or equal if they are the same size, based on the same whole, or the same point on a number line. So looking at this one standard, there are a lot of sub-skills within that standard that could become separate mini lessons. So we could have a mini lesson on the idea of what equivalent means. We could have a mini lesson on comparing fractions, a different mini lesson on plotting fractions on a number line, and even the initial understanding of what exactly a fraction is. So for one standard, you can see how we could really break that down into more specific skills. So when we think about the idea of focused, knowing that our standard should be coming from that SACS curriculum map. I may be within a number sense unit. On my map, it's going to show that my unit is number sense, but it's going to list multiple different standards that fall within that unit. So knowing that I can break down a standard into sub-skills. The idea of your mini lesson being narrow helps with the idea of focused. By narrowing a standard, we can also remain concise with time, which is the 3rd bullet there you will notice. But when I look at what from the standard do I need to start with, or where is the area that may need further instruction. When we think back to that 3rd grade standard that we just looked at on the previous slide, I'm going to need to be sure that students understand a lot of foundational ideas before I can be sure that they've mastered that whole standard. And then even more on the idea of being concise, keeping in mind that our mini lesson is that grade level standard, which means for some students, we're going to be instructing at a skill that is too difficult. For some students, we're going to be instructing on a skill that is too easy, and that for the most part, our mini lesson will really target about a third of our class. So trying to be concise and sticking to that around 15-minute time frame is really going to help to keep our mini lesson focused. Our next concept is the idea of being intentional. So when you are thinking about keeping your mini lesson intentional, asking yourself, what was my intention for teaching that skill on that day in that way? So to kind of break that down a little bit more, 3 different things we want to be thinking about: having a responsive progression with our mini lesson, having a format that reflects our intention, and having a variety of formats. So a responsive progression could be planning based on sub-skills within a standard, rather than just treating every standard the same. Seeing that maybe my unit has 5 standards and maybe my unit ends up being 5 weeks, but knowing that just assigning 1 week to each one of those standards probably isn't going to be addressing all of the things that I need to be addressing, and definitely not being as responsive as I could be. So knowing that the amount of time does not always evenly distribute to the number of standards, but instead being responsive to which one of those standards do I feel as a teacher may need more time, which one am I seeing that my students are needing more time on, and so forth. The idea that your format should reflect your intention. So maybe my intention in a mini lesson was to activate my students' schema. So instead of me sitting and just lecturing on what their schema should hold, my mini lesson may be in a format that is more inquiry-based instead of that direct instruction. So my format, again, is reflecting that my intention was to activate their schema, so my format is maybe more inquiry-based. And a variety of formats. That mini lesson should not always be just a sit and get time with the class, but we should be incorporating multiple intelligences, different modalities of learning. We really want their level of engagement to be high, since it's just a short amount of time that we will be talking about that specific skill. The last idea for really keeping our mini lesson as impactful as possible is the idea of it being clear. So some things that you should keep in mind when planning your mini lesson and also teaching your mini lesson. The first one being, how did you and your students know if the lesson's objective was met? And the second one being, is there any way you could have provided more clarity? So to break that down a little bit, taking the idea of being clear and looking at 2 kind of subtopics, your objective and the purpose. We want to have a clear objective so that students know exactly what it is that they are responsible for learning. When you start that mini lesson time, you always want to start with an objective or a statement of mathematicians so that students know when the mini lesson is over today, I know what I was responsible for taking away. Also having a clear objective that allows for you as the teacher to monitor that learning path. And also, it can help you remain accountable. If there's a clear objective for me as a teacher, I know if my mini lesson is maybe veering too far off, and I might need to kind of pull myself back to what it is that objective was. Where if I didn't have a clear objective, it may be easy for my mini lesson to just kind of unfold into something that I didn't want it to be. Having an objective and a clear purpose also focuses the student learning and gives them that ownership that I was talking about earlier about when they are done at that mini lesson time, what they should walk away from. And the objective and purpose also allow students to clearly see connections between concepts by saying, remember yesterday our objective was to revisit what we know about equivalent fractions, and today we're going to tie that into how we can plot different fractions on a number line. They can start to see how I'm going to use what we did yesterday to help me today, and knowing that that pattern is going to continue forward. So just to kind of recap, when we think about mini lesson, we want it to be focused, we want it to be intentional, and we want it to be clear. You only have about 15 minutes with your students each day to talk about grade level standards. So by remaining focused, intentional, and clear, we can really make the most out of those 15 minutes. Thank you so much for joining today.